Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning into this creative session. My name is James, and I'm the product expert for Affinity Photo here at Serif. In this session, I'll be taking you through some of my typical 3D render post-production workflows using Affinity Photo. My software of choice for 3D scene creation and rendering is Blender, so I'll be using the renders created with both its Eevee and Cycles rendering engines. I'll focus on how to take advantage of as much functionality as possible to enable a non-destructive workflow. So I'll do my best to avoid merging layers and permanently committing any editing decisions. Let's get started. I'll start with a straightforward example using this multicolored volumetric render I made. I'll add a simple brightness contrast adjustment to give the tones a bit of punch, just increasing both sliders slightly to achieve this. Now I'll add some structural enhancement to bring out more of the fine detail in these clouds. To achieve this, I'll add a live clarity filter. Then bring the strength slider up all the way. This is far too strong, and I may also want to apply it selectively. So I'll invert the clarity layer, then get the paintbrush tool, create a big soft brush, make sure I'm set to white, and just paint into some of the areas. The effect is still quite excessive, so once I've switched back to the View tool, I'll take the opacity down to 50%. And now this clarity filter just sits there in the layer stack like an adjustment layer. So I can hide it, show it, and change any of its blending parameters whenever I want. Now I'll make the colors really pop, and for this, I will use a selective color adjustment. I've got quite a lot of color going on in this image, so this adjustment is ideal for rebalancing specific color ranges. Once I've made my changes, I'll just hide the adjustment so you can see the before, then show it again so you can see the after. Okay, it's time to add a light diffusion effect. Many of you may be familiar with techniques such as the Orton effect, where you duplicate your layer content, apply a Gaussian blur, then use an appropriate blend mode. I'm going to do that, but non-destructively and with finer control. I'll add a live Gaussian blur filter layer and drag the radius up. Then change the blend mode to overlay. This renders with far too much contrast, so I'll control how the Gaussian blur blends based on tonal range by clicking Blend Options up here. On the Source Layer Ranges graph, I'll create a typical S-curve shape, and on the Underlying Composition Ranges graph, I'll do a simpler curve that pushes the midtone and highlight range up. Hiding and showing the Gaussian blur layer reveals that I've been able to restrict the effect in terms of where it is blending tonally, and the result is much more pleasing. Now I'll show you another non-destructive trick to enhance edge contrast. I'll add a live high-pass filter, and you'll notice the slider only takes you up to 100 pixels. Larger kernel values will have more of a performance impact, so this should be used with care, but you can actually bypass this restriction by manually typing in a value. I'll type 200, then close the dialog. And now I'll set the blend mode to hard light. That's quite a powerful effect, so much so that I might take the opacity down to around 70%. If I was feeling particularly adventurous, I could try duplicating this filter and taking its radius value down to 100 pixels, and I might also take the opacity down further. Now I can select all of my layers, apart from the background layer, and hide them, giving me a quick comparison between the original render and the final result after some post-production. Because the layer stack has been built up with non-destructive techniques, I can always go in and revise my editing choices. For example, I might lower the opacity of these filter layers to reduce the overall structure and contrast enhancement. And there we go, one completed, funky volumetric cloud render. Okay, so that was just a warm-up to get into the swing of post-production in Affinity Photo. Now I'll take you through a more complex example that involves compositing in some background detail, using additional render passes, and further non-destructive layer-based editing. Let's have a look. This is the product of one of my random experiments, where I made some alien-looking terrain and put a big abstract ball of light into the scene as the main point of focus. You may notice the background is transparent. This was an intentional choice, as I was struggling to get a background in Blender I was happy with. By rendering a transparent background, you can give yourself more freedom in post-production to put in some really compelling background detail. So let's start with that. I created a cosmic sky with mountain detail using stable diffusion, and then upscaled it. So I'll drag this in to place it, then move it behind the main background layer, and I'll use the Move tool with snapping to line it up correctly. And now I need to blend this sky in tonally with the foreground. I have a couple of useful techniques to show you here. The first is to use a fill layer. Then drag up from the horizon line to the top of the image, and set the blend mode to screen to create an atmospheric haze effect. This white gradient stop ideally needs to match the fog color, so I'll use the color picker to achieve that. Now, although the colors in the sky detail are nice, they are at odds with the yellow and cyan colors in the foreground. I don't want to lose them entirely, but I can't leave them looking so out of place up here. I'll add a gradient map adjustment underneath the fill layer. Then for the shadow, midtone, and highlight stops, I'll color pick off the various yellow colors in the foreground. Finally, I'll set the adjustment blend mode to hue and just bring the opacity down to around 70%. A final tip is to be mindful of depth of field and general sharpness of different areas in your render. Being right at the background, for example, it may make sense to blur this detail slightly. I'll add a live lens blur filter to achieve this, and bring the radius up to around 3 pixels. It's very subtle, but it just adds that extra bit of polish to the optical aspects of the render. And there we go. The sky now sits much better tonally with the foreground. Above the main background layer, I'll now create a levels adjustment. I want to start creating a matte black look for this render, so I'll drag the output black level slider up slightly, then bring the gamma slider to the right, and finally, I'll bring the white level slider in. This makes some of the highlight detail more intense, but creates a softer contrast in the darker tones. Now I'll start bringing in some additional render passes to enhance the image. This energy ball object uses an emission shader around the edge detail, so I've saved out the emit pass from Blender as a separate image. I'll place this above the main render and align it, then set its blend mode to screen. At the moment, this is just brightening the emissive detail, but I can apply a live Gaussian blur filter to this layer and drag the radius slider all the way up to add a diffuse glow effect around the object. Next, I'll bring in the mist pass. Now, the mist pass is often used with the compositing functionality in Blender as a computationally cheap way of adding an atmospheric mist effect to the render. I'm going to use it in a very similar fashion. So, I'll set the mist layer's blend mode to screen. Then I'll create a levels adjustment and child layer it inside. The effect is very strong to begin with, but I can control it using the output black and white level sliders. You can also experiment with the other sliders, but just using these two works for what I'm trying to achieve here. Now what I can also do is add a recolor adjustment above the levels adjustment and use it to colorize the mist. Finally, I'll bring the mist layer opacity down to a very low value, such as 10%. And now, if I show you the before and the after, it just adds a really nice, subtle color cast to the image. Next, I'll add the directional volume pass. I'm actually going to perform a very similar workflow here. I'll set the blend mode to screen, then create a levels adjustment and child layer it inside this render pass. I want to bring the gamma slider all the way to the right, then gradually bring the white level in until I start to brighten this middle area around the energy ball. Now, I'll use a selective color adjustment to really push the colors around. With reds, I'll take the cyan slider down, and that will really accentuate the intensity of these reds. Then, with greens, I'll bring the cyan slider up, magenta down slightly, and yellow down as well. And with cyans, I'll take the yellow slider all the way down. And this really makes the color of the energy ball pop. To tweak the colors further, I'll create an HSL adjustment. And on the cyan color range, I'll bring the luminosity shift slider up, which will brighten the energy ball tones, but also reduce the color intensity slightly. If you didn't want this effect, you could switch to the HSV color model, but I actually like the saturation fall off here. I'll also do this for the yellow color range, bringing luminosity shift up a small amount. If I'm unsure about the overall color temperature of the image, I can quickly indulge myself and experiment with a white balance adjustment. Not to be confused with white balance during photographic RAW development, this adjustment version is more of a creative tool rather than a corrective tool and lets you quickly shift the overall color temperature around. I might experiment with a slightly cooler feel for the whole image, and perhaps bring the tint towards the right for a magenta bias as well. Now, as a final step for this render, I want to try and add some organic-looking grain to the image. This is a popular technique to stop 3D renders looking so sterile, especially if they've been through denoising. Blender, for example, uses open image denoise by default on the final render, and whilst this cleans up path tracing noise very effectively, it can sometimes look almost too clean and lifeless. So, I'm going to use a live add noise filter and bring the intensity slider nearly all the way up. But I'll now create a new group and drag the add noise filter inside it. Then above this layer, I'll add a live motion blur filter layer. I only need to use a very small value here, such as 1 pixel. Then I'll bring the opacity down on the parent group. And there we go, a nice looking grain effect. I could take this a step further and use the Blend Options dialog, then use the Underlying Composition Ranges graph to stop this grain effect from blending into the highlight detail so much. By the way, always preview live filters at 1:1 or 100% zoom to see an accurate result. As a final step, I could use a simple brightness contrast adjustment to add a little bit of contrast back into the image, and maybe push the brightness up ever so gently as well. Okay, and I think I'll leave it there for this render. It can be very tempting sometimes to over-edit because you have so many options available, but it always helps to save your work, step away, and come back at a later date with a fresh perspective on the result. Now, as a bit of a bonus, I'll show you a workflow I have to use when working with overlapping volumetrics in Blender. It utilizes masking in Affinity Photo, so this is a good technique to cover. I've started working on my final image here. But if I zoom in, you'll notice that I'm lacking the actual fire detail in all these areas. These should have been the VDB files I was using, but they didn't render correctly when combined with the general volumetric fog in the scene. So I rendered them out as a separate pass called flames. I chose not to save alpha channel data with this pass so I can blend it manually. I'll place it into the scene, turn snapping on, and line it up. Then set the blend mode to screen. Now this looks okay, but you'll notice if I hide this layer that parts of the flames should be occluded. So I'll add a mask layer using this option here, select the paintbrush tool and use the keyboard modifier to create a small soft round brush. Then paint with black onto the mask to hide parts of the flame detail. And I'll just repeat this process for all of the flames across the image. And we just have these two over here. And there we go. Now the flame detail is so small when put into context of the overall image, but it's attention to detail like this that helps to add the final polish to your renders. I'll also show you another technique with the mist pass, which I'll place and line up. Traditionally, with a screen blend mode, this will gradually add more mist the further back the detail goes in the image, but you can switch this round non-destructively. I'll add an invert adjustment and child layer it into the mist layer. Then I'll set the parent mist layer's blend mode to screen. This looks pretty terrible at the moment, but as I did with the previous example, I'll create a levels adjustment, child layer it, then bring the output level sliders in. And finally, I'll take the mist layer opacity down to 50%. At this point, the effect of the invert adjustment becomes more subtle. But it does help to add a little bit of a matte effect to the figure and the background here. Now, don't be afraid to add more composition elements to your renders in post-production if it helps the final result. For example, on the Assets panel, I've got some of the content that can be acquired from the Affinity store. I'll drag some of these fog overlay assets onto the document and scale and position them until I find a layout that looks good. Rather than adjust the opacity of these layers individually, I could instead select and group them, then change the opacity of the group, which is a more efficient approach if I want them all to have a uniform opacity anyway. I'll also bring in this light leak and position it over to the right, but use a very low opacity, so it becomes incredibly subtle. Then I might quickly add a curves adjustment and create a few nodes to give the scene some more contrast and bring out the highlight intensity. Finally, I'll create a non-destructive light diffusion effect. For this, I'll use a live Gaussian blur filter and bring the radius up. But this time, I'll set the blend mode to hard light. This is a really aggressive effect, but rather than lowering the opacity, I'll access the blend options. And on both graphs, I'll bring the left-hand node down, so the effect is gradually blended out of the shadow and midtone detail. This leaves me with a nice diffuse light effect on specific bright areas of the image. And there we go, some workflow examples for Blender post-production using Affinity Photo. I hope you've enjoyed watching this creative session and you've found it useful. Don't forget to check out the other creative sessions and, of course, the roster of video tutorials on the official Affinity Photo YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.